1,000 engine kits a week, leaving a building on South Sanford Street in Pontiac, Michigan, in the winter of 1947. That is 4 kits every working hour, stacked in cardboard boxes, heading to 3,500 dealers from Maine to California. The building is gone now, absorbed into Oakland County's geography, after Pontiac itself was dissolved in 2013, the city's debt too large to sustain. Its tax base collapsed with the industry that built it. Where the kits were packed and shipped, someone sells something else. The machine inside those boxes was not a motorcycle, not a scooter, not quite a bicycle. The Whizzer motorbike occupied the narrow, specific territory between the two, a standard balloon tire Schwinn, cantilever, or Columbia Roadmaster, onto whose frame a man with a wrench set and a Saturday afternoon could bolt an air-cooled, single-cylinder, 4-stroke engine displacing 8.45 cubic inches, 138 cubic centimeters, generating 1 3/8 horsepower at full song, and carrying its rider to 35 miles per hour while drinking fuel at a rate the company's advertising translated as 6 to 10 miles to the penny, between 120 and 200 miles per gallon in 1947. On a machine that cost $89.50 complete. The sound it made was unmistakable. Not a roar. There is no roar in 138 cubic centimeters. A chatter. A high-pitched, mechanical conversation between one small piston and the road beneath it. A sound that porch sitters on summer evenings in 1948 knew before the machine came into view, because nothing else on American roads made that particular noise. It was the sound of motion made affordable. The sound of a 17-year-old who had worked 12 weeks of Saturdays at the hardware store, bolted the kit to his Schwinn in the garage, and was now, for the first time in his life, faster than his legs. By 1952 it was over. A working Model A Ford cost $50 at auction that year. $50 against the $109.97 that a Whizzer engine kit demanded. The Italian Vespa arrived with its enclosed engine and sealed chain case, making the Whizzer's exposed belt drive look improvised. State legislatures set the motorbike licensing age at 16, erasing the machine's most devoted market segment in a single legislative session. Honda's engineers in Japan were at their drafting tables. The window the Whizzer had climbed through was closing from both sides simultaneously. This is a story about how a machine built for a gap, economic, temporal, cultural, was undone when the gap closed. Not incompetence, not bad faith. A company that solved one specific problem with remarkable precision and then watched the problem be solved by other means. The men who didn't know it was impossible. In July 1939, Breen Taylor, Engineering of Los Angeles, an aircraft parts manufacturer whose primary business was supplying the aviation industry's growing appetite for precision components, placed an advertisement in Popular. Mechanics announcing the Whizzer Model D bicycle motor. The kit sold for $54.95. The engine was a single-cylinder, side valve, 4-stroke unit with a 2-to-1, 4-inch bore and a 2-to-1, 8-inch stroke. Displacement, 8.45 cubic inches. Power, 1 3/8 horsepower. Drive system, a friction roller pressed against the rear tire tread. The name Whizzer, according to one account that persists in the collector literature without definitive confirmation, came from Byron Whizzer, White, the University of Colorado halfback, who was then playing for the Pittsburgh Steelers and who had earned his nickname by moving very fast through people who were trying to stop him. White would become a Supreme Court justice in 1962. Whether the men at Breen Taylor actually named their product after a football player who had not yet become famous for anything permanent is a question they never definitively answered. The name fit regardless. The Model D was not reliable. The friction roller wore through tire treads in ways that buyers discovered between 50 and 100 miles into ownership. The rubber of the tire met the aluminum of the roller at a contact patch, perhaps 3/4 of an inch wide. And the power transfer across that patch generated heat and abrasion that the system's designers had underestimated. The roller itself wore flat over time, reducing the contact area and the power transfer simultaneously, so that a machine that had once reached 30 miles per hour would gradually, imperceptibly, begin to top out at 25, then 20, as the roller wore down. The cylinder head had a tendency to work loose under sustained vibration, one cylinder firing at 3,700 revolutions per minute, shaking the entire assembly with the persistence of a machine that had only one piston to do everything with. The head would back off its threads gradually, and then the engine would begin to run differently. Hotter, rougher, leaking. Most owners recognized the symptoms. Some ignored them until the repair became expensive. Sales between 1,939 and 1,942 reached, depending on the source, somewhere between 300 and 1,500 units. Breen Taylor, whose aircraft contracts were expanding with wartime demand, decided to exit the bicycle engine business in 1942. Dietrich Kolsat was an investor in Breen Taylor. Martin Goldman was the firm's attorney. Neither was an engineer. But Henry Shuricht was a Breen Taylor engineer who had worked on the Whizzer since its introduction, who understood every place the Model D failed and had opinions about why. When Kolsat and Goldman bought the Whizzer operation, Shuricht came with it. He would design every significant improvement to the Whizzer engine from 1943 through the final 700 series in 1952, his name appearing in no advertisements, his fingerprints on every carburetor throat and crankcase wall. Kolsat and Goldman looked at a product with sales of perhaps 1,500 units over 3 years and saw not failure but proof of concept awaiting proper execution. They were right about that. They were also right about something else, that the war, which seemed like an obstacle, was actually an argument. The two cities, Los Angeles to Pontiac. To understand what Kolsat and Goldman built from the Whizzer's wreckage, you have to understand the two cities the machine called home. Los Angeles in 1939 was already organized around the automobile in a way that no other American city matched. The Pacific Electric Railway, once the largest electric railway system in the world, its red cars carrying workers from the San Fernando Valley to downtown, from the beach communities to the factory districts, was contracting, being sold off piece by piece to a consortium that included General Motors and Firestone and Standard Oil. The city built for the car would keep being built for the car, for the workers who commuted to the growing aerospace facilities in Santa Monica, Burbank, and Inglewood Douglas Aircraft, Lockheed, North American Aviation. The question of getting to and from the factory was not abstract. Distances were real. Gasoline cost money. Buses ran on schedules that didn't always match shift changes. A bicycle was inadequate for the miles. A car was expensive to buy and maintain. The Whizzer at $54.95 occupied the precise economic gap between those two options. When it worked, when the friction roller didn't wear through the tire, when the cylinder head didn't loosen under vibration, it was the answer to a question that hundreds of thousands of Los Angeles workers were asking every morning. Pontiac, Michigan, in 1945, was a different kind of city, organized around a different kind of manufacturing. General Motors' Pontiac Motor Division dominated the employment landscape. The suppliers and subcontractors that had grown up around it, foundries, machining houses, aluminum casters, electrical component manufacturers, had spent 4 years retooled for war production and were now available for conversion back to civilian work. The Wilson foundry, which would cast the cylinders for the post-war Whizzer, had made tank components. Bone aluminum and brass, whose Bonelite brand would be stamped into every Whizzer crankcase, had made aircraft pistons. The men running the machines had held tolerances of plus or minus a thousandth of an inch for applications where failure meant catastrophic loss. The Whizzer engine was the simplest thing they had made in years. It was almost, for them, a resting project. Colsat and Goldman moved the Whizzer operation from Los Angeles to Pontiac in 1945. Not because Pontiac was a natural center of motorbike demand, it was not, but because Pontiac was a center of production capacity. They needed volume. They were not moving toward their customers. They were moving toward the infrastructure that would let them serve their customers at a scale the Los Angeles facility could never approach. When they introduced the improved Model H engine in March 1946, they were introducing it from a facility capable of producing 190 units per day, 7 days a week. Everything that had happened before the Model D's failures, the wartime restriction to defense workers, the slow accumulation of 1,000, 500, or 4,000, or whatever the real number was prelude. What came next was not prelude. What came next was the real thing. And by August 1945, the Whizzer had established something more valuable than a market position, a reputation, the machine that had kept defense workers moving, the machine that the government had specifically authorized when it authorized almost nothing else civilian. In the Popular Mechanics and Popular Science advertisements of 1,946 and 1,947, the copy leaned on it quietly. Americans who had spent 4 years in factories building things for the war were now ready to buy things for themselves, and the Whizzer had been part of that war effort. That mattered. Not sentimentally, commercially. Trust, once built into a product, does not vanish when peacetime returns. Washington, 1943. The argument that saved everything. The War Production Board, established in January 1942, controlled the allocation of strategic materials, steel, aluminum, rubber, and answered requests for civilian production allocations, with the skepticism appropriate to a country converting its economy to warfare at unprecedented speed. A bicycle engine kit for recreational use had no defensible claim on those materials. Colsat flew to Washington. The argument he made was not about recreation, it was about commutation. Defense workers, the hundreds of thousands of men and women who had moved to Los Angeles, Detroit, Seattle, Hartford, to work in the aircraft, plants, and shipyards and munitions factories that the war required, needed to get from their apartments and rooming houses to their work sites every morning and back every evening. Gasoline rationing made automobile commuting expensive and unreliable. Public transit was overwhelmed. A bicycle was adequate for short distances, but a bicycle with an engine consuming 6 to 10 miles to the penny, the same calculation the advertising used for peacetime buyers, was the most fuel-efficient individual transport available. The Whizzer was not a toy. It was infrastructure for war production. The War Production Board agreed. In 1943, an agreement was signed permitting continued production, with one restriction: purchasers must present certification of defense employment. You needed proof that you built something the war needed before you could buy the machine that got you there. The 1943 new model, designated the Model F, made the change that would define every Whizzer that followed. The friction roller was gone. In its place, a large aluminum sheave bolted to the rear wheel spokes, driven by a V-belt running from a clutch pulley on the engine's output shaft. The sheave bolted to the spokes. This was, by any engineering standard, an imperfect solution, adding rotational mass to the wheel and stress to spoke attachment points never designed for it. But it worked. It worked where the roller had not. The belt ran true, transferred power consistently, and could be replaced by any owner who could read the installation manual. The Model F sold 4,000 units before the war ended. That was not a large number, but the V-belt drive was not going away. A photograph from the Whizzer promotional archive dated 1,944 shows 8 or 9 workers standing outside what appears to be a West Coast factory gate, several of them astride motorized bicycles. All of them looking at the camera with the particular expression of people who have been told to look natural. The Whizzer machines are identifiable by their teardrop tanks, strapped to the top tubes, and the specific geometry of the sheave and belt assembly. The riders are wearing work clothes. Behind them, the factory gate is open. They did not know they were in an advertisement. They thought they were going to work. Pontiac, March 1946, the machine that America wanted. Henry Shurek did not give speeches. According to accounts from people who worked alongside him in the Pontiac facility during the late 1940s, accounts preserved in collector correspondence and the Whizzer historical record at motorbicycling.com, he communicated primarily by demonstrating. When a part was wrong, he showed you how it was wrong. When it was right, he sometimes said nothing at all, just turned the assembled component over in his hands for a moment before setting it down. The Model H engine, which Shurek completed for the March 1946 introduction, addressed every place the earlier designs had failed. The split crankcase, cast in 2 vertical halves bolted together, sealing imperfectly against the engine's vibration, was replaced by a one-piece casting with a removable side cover. The crankshaft was redesigned with a roller bearing at one end and a ball bearing at the other, replacing the plain bearings that had worn early in previous engines. The tappets were set to tolerances that allowed for the thermal expansion the engine actually experienced. The Tillotson carburetor replaced the earlier Breen-Taylor unit, delivering more consistent mixture across the throttle range. The result, 2.5 horsepower at 3,700 revolutions per minute from the same 8.45 cubic inches that had produced 1.375 horsepower in the Model D. The difference was not displacement. The difference was Shurek's specific attention to every place energy was being lost before it reached the rear wheel. Add the 5-quart tank, the sheave, the mounting hardware, and the complete installation weighed approximately 35 pounds. Bolt it to a Schwinn cantilever frame of 65 pounds. Add a 150-pound rider, and you had 250 pounds moving at 35 miles per hour, a power-to-weight ratio that no proper motorcycle would boast about, but that no bicycle could approach. The machine weighed 100 pounds complete. It was pedal-started. You held the compression release lever open on the handlebars, preventing the engine from firing, and pedaled to 5 miles per hour. Then you released the lever and waited. The engine caught. The chatter began. Not gradually, it arrived in the first compression, the first ignition event, and settled immediately into its characteristic voice, a high, insistent mechanical conversation, the sound of one cylinder firing approximately 62 times per second at 3,700 revolutions per minute, the sound audible 3 blocks in any direction, the sound that boys on bicycles heard and turned toward. By March 1948, Whizzer was shipping more than 1,000 kits per week. Between March 1946 and May 1948, 26 months, the company shipped 139,000 Model H engines. That is approximately 190 engines per day, 7 days a week. The Wilson Foundry in Pontiac cast the cylinders. Bone aluminum and brass, whose Bonalite brand was stamped into every crankcase, supplied the aluminum castings. The workers who had machined Jeep engine components during the war were now running the same machines at the same tolerances for a 138cc bicycle motor. They were better at it than the work required. 1,000 kits a week. The peak that felt like a beginning. In May 1948, Dietrich Kohlsaat made an announcement. 150,000 Whizzer engines sold. The dealer network stood at 3,500 outlets, served by more than 144 regional warehouses. The advertising in Popular Mechanics and Popular Science that year carried the tagline, America's Finest Bicycle Motor, and featured, in one memorable full-page layout, a young woman in shorts and a short-sleeved shirt, riding a Schwinn-mounted Whizzer down what appeared to be a suburban driveway, looking sideways at the camera with an expression of uncomplicated pleasure. The caption read, "Ride one and you'll buy one." The accessories catalog from 1948 and 1949 is a document of a company that had found its people and was feeding them what they wanted. Chrome fuel tank, $42. Echo exhaust pipe, which replaced the standard exhaust and changed the engine's voice from a chatter to something closer to a bark, $11. Spring front fork, dual beam headlight, saddlebags, a buddy seat wide enough for a passenger. Bumperettes, the small chrome guards mounted to the front fender of production motorcycles, offered as an option for the Whizzer to signal that this machine aspired to be taken seriously. Buyers ordered them in volume. Don White, the Whizzer production manager, built the first sportsman prototype for his 7-year-old son. Internal company memoranda that the Sportsman went into production the following year, in 1950, at $224.50. Vince Piggins joined the Whizzer engineering effort in the late 1940s, contributing to the Model 300 engine's redesigned combustion chamber. Piggins would later, at General Motors, be the man who convinced the corporation to develop the Z28 Camaro for Trans Am racing, the homologation special that gave Chevrolet a competitive weapon for the 1967 season. In 1948, he was working on a bicycle motor. He cared about the geometry of the combustion chamber in a 138cc engine, the way he would later care about the cylinder head flow rates in a 302 cubic inch racing engine. The work was different in scale. The seriousness was the same. That a man of Piggins' ability was finding the Whizzer interesting enough to work on seriously in 1948 tells you something about where the company stood at its peak. It was attracting engineering talent that had better options and chose not to take them because the problem was real and the scale was large enough to matter. The Model 300, released in September 1949, produced 3 horsepower from the same 8.45 cubic inches, a 120% improvement over the Model Ds, 1.375 horsepower from the same displacement, achieved without adding a single cubic centimeter of engine. Larger valves, 7, 8-inch intake and exhaust against the H's smaller openings allowed more mixture in and more exhaust out per cycle. The compression ratio rose. The combustion chamber geometry, reworked by Piggins and Schuricht, allowed the flame front to travel more efficiently to the cylinder walls, burning the charge more completely before the exhaust valve opened. Top speed, 40 miles per hour. Price, $109.97. It was the best engine the Whizzer ever made. It arrived precisely as the market that would have bought it began to dissolve. 5 forces. By 1952, the market that had taken 139,000 engines in 26 months was taking fewer than 2,000 per year. 5 forces had converged on the Whizzer simultaneously, and any one of them alone might have been survivable. Together they were not. The first was the used car. In 1947, a running Model A Ford cost more than $200 at a dealer auction. The Whizzer kit cost $89.50. The economics favored the kit. By 1952, the same Model A could be purchased for $50.50 against the $109.97 that the Model 300 demanded. A teenager who could save $109.97 could save $50 and own a machine that carried 4 people, kept out the rain, and went 55 miles per hour. The Whizzer's value proposition rested on the specific gap between bicycle and automobile. When that gap closed in dollar terms, the kit became expensive relative to everything. The second was the license. Between $1,950 and 1,955. Most American state legislatures enacted or strengthened provisions requiring driver's licenses for motorbike operation, setting the minimum age at 16. The reasoning was defensible. Machines capable of 40 miles per hour, operated on public roads with no formal training requirement, were producing accidents. The effect was categorical. The buyers under 16, the ones who had pasted the advertisements to their bedroom walls, who had argued the case for the kit to their parents across the dinner table, who had shown their friends the catalog and discussed which accessories to order, were prohibited from purchasing, not discouraged, prohibited. The third was the Italian. The Vespa, designed by aeronautical engineer Corradino d'Ascanio and produced by Piaggio from 1946, reached American showrooms in modest but growing numbers by 1951. The Lambretta followed. Both were purpose-built machines with enclosed engines, sealed final drives, and pressed steel bodywork that protected the rider from contact with the mechanical assembly. They cost more than the Whizzer kit. A Vespa sold for $300 to $350 in American dealerships, but they offered something the Whizzer could not. They looked modern. They did not require their owner to bolt anything to a bicycle frame. Their engines were invisible, enclosed behind smooth Italian curves, and this invisibility was not primarily a technical advantage but a social one. You rode a Vespa and appeared to be operating a machine conceived specifically for you, whole, designed, intentional. You rode a Whizzer and appeared to be operating a bicycle with additional hardware. The fourth was the Bimatic. The automatic transmission introduced on the 1950 Sportsman, manufactured by Reef Industries, was built with standard bicycle bearings throughout its internals. The design engineers at Reef either did not anticipate the loads the transmission would experience or accepted a cheaper bearing spec to reduce unit cost. Caged automotive bearings would have cost more per unit. The Bimatic bearings failed in service, seized, stripped, disintegrated in ways that were unpredictable and difficult to repair in the field. The transmission was withdrawn after approximately a year. Its reputation, however, was not withdrawn. Dealers who had sold machines with the Bimatic fielded returns and complaints through 1951 and 1952 and told the next customer about it. The fifth was the overhead valve. Aftermarket manufacturers produced OHV conversion kits for the Whizzer engine in the early 1950s, and the converted engines with their intake valves moved from the block to the head, allowing a more efficient combustion chamber geometry and higher compression ratios, produced meaningfully more power from the same displacement. Collectors who have run these conversions report top speeds approaching 50 miles per hour from an engine that in stock form is limited to 40. The engineers at Whizzer knew about these conversions. They also knew that the Whizzer's crankshaft, connecting rod, and lower engine assembly were not designed to sustain the higher cylinder pressures an OHV top end would generate at sustained high revolutions. The bearing loads increased, the rod stress increased. A proper OHV Whizzer would have required a new bottom end, new crankshaft, new connecting rod, new main bearings, new cases to hold them. That meant a new engine. That meant capital the company chose not to allocate. The choice was not unreasonable, given the resources available. It was, in retrospect, the moment the company's technical ceiling became permanent. The five forces arrived in different years. By 1952, they were all present simultaneously. 1,952. The silence after the chatter. By 1952, the numbers were speaking clearly. In 1946 and 1947 combined, the Whizzer had sold nearly 140,000 engines, 70,000 per year, at an average price of roughly $90, which is $6.3 million annually in 1947 dollars. By 1951, the 600 series sold approximately 1,500 units for the year. That is not a decline. A decline is gradual, managed, amenable to response. A collapse from 70,000 to 1,500 inches 4 years is something different. It is the market removing itself, not shifting, not migrating to a competitor, dissolving because the specific conditions that had made the product necessary had ceased to exist. Model 300 series, approximately 15,000 units sold. Model 500 series, approximately 2,300 units. Model 600 series, approximately 1,500 units. Model 700 series, the final design, with integrated alternator, the most technically sophisticated engine Whizzer built, approximately 5,300 units. The trajectory from 70,000 per year to 1,500 per year is not a decline. A decline implies gradualism. This was a collapse, a market that had existed at one scale and then, over 3 years, did not exist at that scale anymore. In 1952, the same year Shurikt completed the 700 series, Honda Motor Company in Japan introduced the Honda Cub F, a 50cc, purpose-built motorized bicycle with a proper single-speed transmission and Honda's manufacturing precision behind every component. The Cub F was not imported to the United States in 1952, but it would become, in its evolved form as the Super Cub, the best-selling motor vehicle in human history, more than 100 million units by the early 2000s. What Honda understood that Whizzer did not was that the market for low-cost personal transportation was permanent. Only the product specification had to change. By 1955, Whizzer Industries, Incorporated, the name had changed. The direction had changed. With it was manufacturing children's toys and wagons, residential windows, and sliding doors. The motorcycle division continued selling engine kits from parts inventory through the late 1950s and into the 1960s. The motor division was formally terminated on the 1st of August 1970. On that date, the remaining inventory, more than 100 complete engine kits in their original cardboard boxes, along with a substantial collection of individual components, was acquired by Leonard Davis. What remained of the Davis collection by the late 1990s, reduced to fasteners, gaskets, and small hardware, was acquired by collector Larry Master. Master continued to sell individual pieces to the community of people who needed them. The last Whizzer part from the factory inventory sold for a price that has not been publicly recorded. Someone has it somewhere. The Pontiac that forgot. The city of Pontiac, Michigan, was dissolved on the 1st of December 2013. Its debts were unsustainable, the consequence of a tax base that had declined with the automobile industry and a municipal cost structure that had not declined with it. Oakland County assumed governance. The name Pontiac survived as a geographic designation. The city, as a legal and political entity, did not. The Whizzer Motor Company had moved to Pontiac in 1945, specifically to be near the automobile industry, near the Wilson Foundry, near Bone Aluminum, near the workforce that the war had trained to machine metal precisely and quickly. The automobile industry eventually destroyed Pontiac as a municipal entity. The building on South Sanford Street, where the kits were packed and shipped, carries no marker. The collector community, organized primarily through the Antique Motorcycle Club of America, whose annual meet at Wauseon, Ohio, draws surviving Whizzers from across the country, does not maintain a physical presence there. The Lane Motor Museum in Nashville holds a Schwinn-built WZ model from 1948, its frame showing the specific modifications Schwinn made for the Whizzer installation. The notched rear fender, the thicker spokes, the heavier spring coils, the front drum brake added because a machine capable of 35 miles per hour needed something more than a coaster hub to stop it. These modifications are not glamorous. They are the modifications of a manufacturing company that took a product's practical requirements seriously enough to re-engineer a bicycle frame for them. Original Whizzer machines in working condition sell for between $800 and $8,800 at current auction prices, the high-end reserved for documented pacemakers and sportsman models. A pristine Ambassador, gloss black, ivory trim, chrome plating. The top-of-the-line complete motorbike in Whizzer's catalog commands prices at the upper range of that spectrum when one appears. In 1997, a group of investors incorporated Whizzer USA Incorporated in Addison, Texas, and contracted with Polar Manufacturing in Taiwan to produce reproduction Whizzers. The new machines use the same 138cc flathead engine design and the same basic layout as the originals. The power output was 1.95 horsepower against the Model H's 2.5 and the 300's 3. Top speed, 25 to 30 miles per hour. The originals had done 35 to 40. The revivals sold through dealers and the company's website until approximately 2009, when production ceased. The revival Whizzers are worth less than the originals. They are also, according to the riders who use them, perfectly adequate for what a Whizzer is supposed to do. They make the same basic sound, a slightly quieter version of the same sound. The gap that closed. Return to South Sanford Street. Return to 1947. To the week of 1,000 kits, the 3,500 dealers. The boxes moving west and south and east from a building that smelled of machine oil and cardboard, and the particular institutional optimism of a company that has found its moment. The Whizzer's genius was its specificity. It was designed for a gap that existed in American life between roughly 1,939 and 1,952. The gap between the bicycle's range and the automobile's cost. In a country where personal mobility mattered enormously and resources were constrained by depression, then redirected by war, then liberated unevenly by recovery, that gap was real. The Whizzer filled it honestly, with a product that did what its advertising claimed. 6 to 10 miles to the penny, 35 miles per hour, 3,500 dealers who could show you how to install it. The gap closed. Used cars became cheap. Licenses became required. Italian engineers designed machines that were complete rather than assembled. Japanese engineers began building machines that would eventually redefine the entire category. The Whizzer could have responded with a better engine, an overhead valve design, a transmission that actually worked, and would have, perhaps, with different management decisions or different capital availability. Henry Schurecht knew what the engine needed. He had known for years. The company chose refinement over reinvention. Colsat and Goldman were not incompetent. They had taken a product with 3 years of failed sales and turned it into the most successful motorized bicycle in American history. They had argued it into wartime production when every rational assessment said it should have been shut down. They had moved the operation 1,000 miles to the right manufacturing city and scaled it from hundreds of units per year to nearly 1,000 per week. The failure, if it is a failure, was not executive incompetence. It was the limit of a company organized to produce one specific product at one specific price for one specific window of time. When the window moved, they could not move with it. What Henry Schurecht thought about this, the record does not say. He completed the 700 series in 1952, turned in his work, and is not further named in the company's surviving documents. Someone at the Pontiac facility must have noticed when he stopped coming in. Someone must have straightened up after the last day. Someone, on the 1st of August 1970, turned off the lights in the motor division office for the last time and locked the door. There is no account of that moment. The motor division termination form was filed. The inventory was sold to Leonard Davis. The parts were dispersed, slowly, across the years. Stand at the Wauseon meet in September, when the Ohio morning is still cool and the machines are lined up on the fairground grass. Watch the rider approach the Model H on its Schwinn cantilever, adjust the compression release, begin to pedal. Watch him reach 5 miles per hour. Watch him release the lever. And the chatter begins. It is the sound of a specific window, open for 8 years, closing in 1952 and never reopening. It is enough. Share.